And tonight we have Jimmy Hardison. Jimmy is from my hometown community. I was raised in Plymouth, and his family has lived in Martin County. In fact, he lives in a beautiful historic house as you cross over into Martin County from Plymouth. He retired from the ABC store. He worked there his entire career and managed that. And he says all his life that he's loved history. He started off, he said, with the Revolutionary War being his biggest point of interest. Then it turned into the Civil War. And now, as you see on the table, he has all these artifacts from the southern shore, which is the Washington County area in Martin County. I used to live in Mackey's for a long time in Washington County. It's right across the Albemarle Sound on the southern shore, and I was shocked at the life that used to be there, and I knew nothing about it. So he told me a lot of things about the artifacts that he's going to share with you tonight, found in my own community. I could have thrown a rock where a whole establishment used to be near my house. No evidence whatsoever except these things. Also, another interesting fact, and then I'm going to let him go, is he told me, I'm a Davenport, he told me about the Davenports, the Hardisons, and the Blunts. Is that right? See, I was a good student one night. I said my mother-in-law was a Davenport who married a Davenport, and they claimed they weren't kin. He cleared that up for me. So, if you want to hear more about that, then ask the question at the end of how that came to be. So Jimmy he's an expert now. He started off as an amateur. He is an expert, and he's collaborated with other experts. I think they were each other's students. Harry Thompson was one of them from Windsor, and gosh, you could sit for hours and listen. So let's just listen to him for about 45 or 50 minutes now. So Jimmy Hardison.
Greetings from the South Shore. Jill said one thing I want to clear up. I always tell that when I was giving talks and stuff around, I thought I had retired. but anyhow, to me, an expert in stuff like this is the people who lived it at the time. They were the experts. And, we just come along and pick up where they left off and take up what we could find out what they left behind. But I've been around a while, and I've done this for a long time, so I've gained a little knowledge. And I've been fortunate to have consorted with some people who were really knowledgeable, studied and learned it, and I learned a lot from them. But basically, I learned most of my stuff from actually doing it myself, digging it out of the ground. And basically what I want to do tonight, I'm not going to do a whole lot of genealogy stuff. I just want to convey to you that the world did not pass eastern North Carolina by from the very beginning. I mean, we were here early. And you look at your larger places, and those are places most people focus on. You know, towns like Edenton, you know, the larger places, and well documented, and when they were here and what people did here. But when you get away from the town and get out in the country and in the outback regions, such as in the early days what the South Shore was, because there wasn't many people over there. There was a lot of people there, but they weren't in groups gathered together. And basically, one of the things that I started doing in the Washington County area and Lower Martin County area for my knowledge and my general of the people that I was researching, my main interest in was trying to locate specific house sites. And in doing so, I came across other ones, smaller ones, some larger than others, and I'll get into that some later down. But in looking at specific house sites, I began to learn that the artifacts that I was digging from there and retrieving from there, they become like a book. You can read them just like a book. Artifacts don't lie. What's in the ground and what you take from there tell the story of who was there, when they were there, and how long they were there, and what they left behind. I mean, what you dig out of the ground, what you retrieve from that site is exactly what life was there. And with me, it was so personal because while on these sites, you get involved. If you've been a digger or you're into this sort of thing, you understand that when you pick up something, you look at it, the first thing you say is, who dropped it? Why was it here? You know, this sort of thing. This is what tells you your story. And that's what fascinated me for so long about finding stuff. In particular, if I could put it with a particular site, you know, that was all the more good. And what am I going to do is, and I know, and I want to apologize to a lot of people because they're not used to seeing artifacts in this condition. Because when you go to a museum, they clean them up, fix them up so you can see them. You have to do that. I understand that. But to me, changing an artifact takes away the character of the artifact. And you can also destroy an artifact by cleaning it, particularly coins and buttons. You have to be really careful. I always tell everybody, never clean a coin to a certain degree. Have a professional or somebody knows what they're doing if you're going to clean one. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out in some of the early years, and what I'll do is I'll tell you about some of these artifacts. And a lot of them you'll have to get up close to, and you can read on what I've got on here, what they are. And later on we'll have discussions about them and questions and stuff. But what I want to prove to you is that at these sites, the artifacts that I'm digging up, we can date these things. I mean, here's another thing about artifacts, and it depends on what it is. Things hadn't changed. Styles started out earlier. There wasn't a whole lot of changing styles from the late 1500s, 1600s, and middle 1700s. Styles didn't change an awful lot. However, in some items they did. But it graduated from the 1700s. About every 30 or 40 years, you can date an artifact within about 30 or 40 years. And as you go up in time, it can get even smaller. Particular buttons and stuff from the 1830s and 40s, right on up to the 1860s and 65 and 70s. You can date a button within 10 years or 5 years, you know. And you go right back to the beginning, and some of these buttons in the early years, you can date them within 5 or 10 years because of their design, what they're made out of, and this sort of thing. This is what makes everything so interesting in the early years. Fortunately, we know better now, but back in the early days, utensils and stuff for your regular person, most of the stuff was made out of pewter and lead. And so we know, you know, you wonder how anybody survived because everything they had to eat out of and use everything was pewter or lead. And so in the early days, something like this right here, pewter spoons, and they were all different sizes, uses for everything. I mean, large ones to the really small one. This one is rolled up. Somebody just took the time to roll that small pewter spoon up. But these actually came from exactly where Seal was talking about. These came out of the water right at the mouth of Mackey's Creek. So, and this bottom piece is actually half of a mold that they used to make pewter. And the reason you find so much in pewter in the early days is they bought some with them, but they had to have stuff to replace it with. And they bought molds with them. But now everybody can't sit down and make a pewter spoon. Pewter is a little tricky to work with. And so you had to know a little bit of something about it. But in the early years, pewter spoons was what you will find in your early 1700 house sites. So you'll find pewter spoons. And other items made out of pewter also, but the utensils are going to be out of pewter. Now, what little bit of furniture and stuff that they bought to carry over to like that was stuff that most of them bought over here when they come. here again, you got to remember, in the early 1700s, there isn't a Walmart down the road, or there isn't anywhere they could go out and pick up a piece of furniture and stuff like that. They made a lot of their own. There were some artisans around, you know, that made good quality furniture. But here is where the issue of transportation and why we weren't left behind so much in the early years, because we're on water. And the trade between the northern states and the southern states and everywhere else come by water. We were able to get items from all over the world, right on up to right in here in the Albemarle Sound, right on up to Kendrick's Creek, you know, right on up to Chevron River. You know, in the town of Roper, one of the plantation homes over there, Buncombe Hall, Mr. Buncombe had his own ship that he sailed and traded items. They were from the West Indies mostly, and that's where they bought items from. An awful lot of the trade that went on here in our part of the state was by the West Indies. It came from overseas through the islands and then back up to us. An awful lot of it did. And here again, relic-wise, you can tell me, you know, at every place where the ships come in, and you see them all around here, and I'm sure and anywhere else near the sound, you see ballast stones. But did you know that you can actually tell where most of the ballast stones come from? By the type of rockings they are. So here again, you can tell by the artifacts on the thing where the most of the trade was coming from. And we have that all over around. There was a fellow in here probably 10, 15 years ago. That was his specialty. And I wished many times that I had been able to write down a lot of stuff that he was telling about where the types of ballast stones came from, where they were originally coming from. But get back to the other artifacts, you know, we had items that we could purchase that were bought in by trade methods. A lot of them were made. Blacksmith shops was a big thing early on because they had to make a lot of stuff. And in this case right here, knives made out of iron, spikes made out of iron. They made their own stuff, not necessarily just out of iron, but other items too. In a site of some size where they would have had a blacksmith shop. Everybody didn't have a blacksmith shop. And most of the time there was one in a given area, or if it was big enough one, like on the plantation there at Buncombe Hall, they had their own blacksmith shop. And they made a lot of stuff to use there on the plantation for their own use. Now, getting back to, we'll get back to the site itself. Some of the items that you take up. You can date a house site by the brick a lot of times. That's pretty easy to do. You can date a house site an awful lot by the glass shards and stuff that you pull from that site. And here again, from dating the types of plates, glass and stuff like that, you can still put a timeline in there on that. Buttons, a particular item that I really enjoy, and it takes an awful lot of study in those. The first buttons that were being made were really just a plain flat button with two holes in it or a hole in it so they could tie it off. The early buttons, most of them were not sewed on. They were tied on. With a buttonhole hanging, they were tied on. But in the late early 1600s, they started to making buttons. Most of them were solid cast, one-piece button with an eye on the back that would attach itself. And there's any number of sizes. The earlier buttons, for the most part, are large. Bring a section of those right here. You see these larger buttons here, and most of those, they're not all coat buttons, but they're that size. The older buttons tend to be the larger ones. And time went by in the early 1700s, they started shrinking a little bit. But it wasn't until about 1780, 1790, 1800 before buttons really started taking a standard size, like for a particular garment. The ladies of the area always wore real dainty buttons for the most part. So when you're digging real small dainty buttons, you got the lady folks around a lot. But the men folks wore a lot of dainty stuff too back in the day. They wore blouses with small buttons too. And so it's not just necessary for the ladies. But now, how to date buttons and the materials that they're made out of. And most of your early buttons were made out of lead or pewter. And in the early days, they actually, in the early 1700s, about 1740, 1750, they had a button material called tombac. And it was a combination of materials, tin, that sort of had a lot of tin in it. And they actually were probably the most durable early buttons that were made. You can actually dig a tombac button that's been in the ground 250, 300 years. And if it's in sand soil, it'll come out shiny. And you'll see some, I got some in here, but they'll actually, and the material, you see that little shiny piece right there? That was a part of a crotal well, but it's made out of tombac material, and it's probably 250, 300 years old. But you can see it's still shiny. And it didn't break down. It got a little brittle at times, but it didn't change colors much. And after the tombac era kind of changed, they started to getting into different metals by now. You're getting some types of brass, or most of it was copper brass, this type of big composition of copper and brass together, and bronze. You run into that. So you can date that period of buttons within a 20, 30, 40 year period, just like you can the other buttons. And it wasn't until about 1820 something, 1830, before buttons started having back marks on them. That really makes it nice, because you can tell from the back mark what years that company was in business. A lot of your early companies were only in business 4 or 5 years. And how were the buttons made, and who did it? There wasn't any button makers over here. So they had to come from England and other parts of the world. And so they came with their crafts, their molds and stuff. And a lot of your early button makers became die setters. They were the ones who started making the die setters. They become the die setters. And putting their particular, the way they were making the buttons. The early buttons were solid cast, most of them were solid cast, but right on up to about I think about their earliest two-piece buttons around 1790, 1800, very few of them then. It wasn't until about 1820, 1825 before they started them constructing two-piece buttons. The French were probably, the French and the British, the English were the ones who started this, but the French were actually the first ones who came up with the idea of a two-piece button. And they did that for a while. And it's easy to tell a French button because it's a two-piece button, and it has right by the shank on the back, it has a little hole in it. They call it a blowhole. Because when they put the two pieces together, they had to have some way for the air to get out. And if they didn't do that, the buttons would stay together. And so that it was called a blowhole button. And that's the easiest way to determine a French-made button. And most of those were like 1790, maybe, but mostly 1810, 1820. Later on, it was in the Gridley brothers up in Massachusetts were making had started making buttons in 1801, 1802 for distribution, and most of them were lead. But they were real nice. They had a little tin mixed in with them, which made them a little nicer button. And so they would, I actually have found Ridley buttons in Washington County. And so they came from there, and they got into business in 1801. And the Ridley brothers was in business for about 6 years. So there's just a 6-year period there. Those buttons got from up there down here to eastern North Carolina. So that tells you, you know, we were getting stuff from all over the world, even at that early age. Buttons continue to get better and more fancier. I mean, you'd be surprised, and when you get a chance to come up and look sometimes, that some of these early buttons, and the detail that's on these big flat buttons, and all that's done by hand. Most all that's done by hand. It wasn't until about around 1800 or so before they started doing much with machine stuff on buttons. And so that's another way of determining the age. And back marks on buttons, with just a very few exceptions, about early 1800 is before they started putting back marks on buttons. And like I say, you can date buttons by that method. Some of the material, it's strange, you know. I watch, and some of the buttons that I dug at the house sites over there, the patterns are the very same patterns as you see out of buttons that's dug in Philadelphia, Massachusetts, in the early days in Charleston. There was a pattern of button called the basket weave pattern, and you see 2 samples of it right here, and both of those are early 1700 patterns right there. But that pattern lasted for about 40 years. And so when you see a basket weave pattern button, you know it was within that time frame pretty much. Other things that you see on the early buttons was the Tudor rose. That when they started putting things on buttons, the Tudor rose was a common thing that you saw back then too. The sunburst designs, a lot of that sign, and they wind up transferring the sunburst signs into a lot of your early coins. The Mexico and the Spanish coins early on, they utilized that same design a lot on their coins. Coins is another thing. Early on, we didn't have nobody producing coins over here, you know, so we had to import them. And so most of your common coins that you find on house sites early on, right on up to early on, especially early sites, are going to be coppers. They were pennies, half pennies, you know, and they would come from different places. Probably 60–70% of the copper coins that was in the early colonies were imported from the Ireland, the English colonies. That's where they came from. Things hadn't changed a lot. In the later years, they began to counterfeit a lot of these coins. You can see on some of the coins where they had been shaved, particularly if you find a silver coin, you have to look real close, because a lot of times they would shave the silver coin around, you know, to take a little off. But it's not uncommon to find a counterfeit looks just like the other, just don't weigh as much. I've got counterfeit copper from King George II, 1760 something. You know, counterfeit coins from 1760 something. And they're fairly easy. They're about 2 millimeters smaller in size, and they're just a little bit lighter, you know. And you can actually tell, I can almost tell a counterfeit coin if I hit one, because they don't ring up as high. They don't give me the same numbers, you know, on your metal program as a regular coin will. You get into And in large country sites, places out in the country where there's not a lot of traffic, you don't find many silver coins. They didn't have many, but you just don't find many silver coins. You find your silver coins around your larger plantation sites or a place on the water where there was a lot of activity. I found out that in a lot of these areas where river traffic came in, and one thing you can find out about a site that's close to the water or any site close by, if you start seeing a lot of these, a lot, that's an indication that they're putting people up. There's a tavern site there, or either, you know, they just take in boarders. For some reason or another, well, I know why, but you'll find pipe stems and pipe bowl parts all around. Here again, you can date those. Back in the early days, I never was much of a fan on the way they talked about how to date a pipe stem. And they did a study in Williamsburg several years ago. Noel Hume has written several books on this type of thing. And they tell you how to date these things. You go in with a specific size cylindrical object, and the larger the hole, the older the pipe stem is going to be. And believe it or not, within about 20 years, you can go in there and tell how they change, you know, from time to time. It's changed. The hole got smaller, you know, as time went on. So that's another way you can date a house site. Is start seeing a lot of these. You know, there was a lot of activity around there, and also by the age of the bowls. You heard it down in the bottom of this one. You'll see those two bowls and pipes right stand right there. That's late 1600. That's late 1600 style. And here again, this comes from the South Shore. You know, there's people over there early, and they were able to get pipe stems. You know, this sort of thing. There were, in the later years, there were people who moved in who were able to do these things, you know. But for the most part, stems and pipe bowls and stuff like that were gotten through trade. Another thing around a house, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, is the brick. You can tell by the type of brick they have there, whether it's an imported brick or not, you know, a really good quality brick. Awful lot of the brick made in the country homes and stuff like that, they made themselves. They can do that. I know over here they had a couple of brick kilns over in Berkeley County. There were about 4 or 5 brick kilns in Berkeley County, just across the river over there, because of the type of clay and stuff they had. That's where you find your brick hill. Head over in Washington County, in Plymouth, right there, they had there's a section here where Red Hill is. The reason it's called Red Hill is because it was a clay hill. And that type of clay made a good brick. And so they would go there and haul away the clay and stuff and make bricks with it. Clothing apparel. Now that's something you can really get into dating the area. And also you can tell by the clothing apparel what kind of situation they were in money-wise. If you find really nice shoe buckles, particularly if you come across one that was silver or gold, you know, that told you that somebody there had a little money, because everybody, everybody didn't have buttons. Fairly decent quality buttons. Everybody didn't have those. If you find a lot of good quality buttons around there, somebody's doing okay for that period of time. Now, shoe buckles, there's all different descriptions and pieces. I love finding the different variations. I've cataloged, I think, 57 different varieties of shoe buckle designs. I've documented 57 different varieties of shoe buckle designs. And they come in all different sizes, small and large, and some really intricate. Now, they had to be imported. There was nobody here at that time, you know, able to do this type of work. They just weren't here. So they had to come in. And surely enough, they had to bring them with them, but I've actually got a few buckles and some parts of buckles that date into 1500s. This the one they call the spectacle buckle, which is this variety right here and this variety right here. They are the earliest utilitarian buckles that are known to man, as far as production wise. And all these are done by hand pretty much, but that buckle, those two buckles right there, are late 1500 buckles, you know, and no doubt they came with the garments that whoever came here with, you know, most likely that early, but chances are they weren't importing these buckles, is what I'm saying, you know. Later on, this type here, this is your next size. This is late early 1700, what they call the figure 8 buckle. There were all different sizes of those, and they were used for everything. But you can use them for anything. You take a buckle like that, you know, you can use it most in case, and that's what they did. One of the few things that you find around old house site too is they had to have weapons, and so most of your early ones were, of course, all your early guns were flintlocks, you know, to come around here, and so you find parts of flintlocks, muskets and stuff around house sites a lot, but you do fairly often, and the different ones. Now, this particular grouping here, I know that it comes from a brown bess musket because I know these parts are on a brown bess lock, and that's the butt plate, and these two flints right here. And believe it or not, you can tell whether they're English or French flints in there. They're different. So you can tell also, now, 2 of these are English and one's French. And all 3 pieces come from Washington County. You know, so they tell you, we were getting stuff from all over the world early on. Time's creeping up on me. There's so much to cover. A lot of the things, and you're welcome to come up and we'll go over some of this later on. The things they use, barrels. They made their own wine, stuff like that. They have barrels and stuff. These are early barrel wines. This is one of your earliest varieties right here. All different types of barrel spigots. I went back to, go back to coins just a minute again. Here are some samples of copper coins that were dug in there, and they start from 1720 and go up to 1801, this particular group in here. And their dates are readable on here on all of these except that one right there. You just have to pick them up and show them around. And here again, like I said, I don't like to claim the stuff. But you got King George I copper coins over here from the 1720 period. You got 1730, 1733, 1757, 1742, 42, 74, 1801, 1797, 1807. So this is typical of your early site copper coins that you find. If you're so lucky, and I want to get back to this, when you find silver coins, and a lot of people don't find the small one, but this is your larger variety of silver coins, and this particular one here is a 2 real from Carlos III, 1782, 2 real, and this is a 1758 2 real from King Ferdinando the 6th. The reason I'm showing you these 2 larger coins is because of this. You didn't trade or spend all this and get change. This was your change. You cut silver into different sizes. And and this is just like making change too, because the denominations of your silver coins were different. You had and most of your silver coins and everything come from Spain and Mexico, South America, down that way, because they were the early ones who had mints. And what they would do, this is a half real, and the weight on a half real was what the weight for a half real was. If you went to a 1 real, it had a certain weight. If you went to a 2 real, it had a certain weight. Right on up, because you know what the big one was. That was the 8 real. And who remembers 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar? That's where it comes from. When you have a piece of 8, which is an 8 real, and you cut it in 4 pieces, you get 2, 4, 6, 8. That's where it comes from. And then if you had to make other change than that, you take one of those quarters and you cut it again. But they all had known weights. And how did they know the weights? All right, in your old sites, if there was a lot of activity there and there was someone who was in the business of selling and trading, they would have a scale. And these right here are scale weights. And they would tell you how much, you had that. The earliest of the silver coins was called the cob coin. They're from 1500 right on up to 1600, early 1700. That's a cob coin right there. All that was a piece of silver melted down to a certain weight, and they would take a stamp and stamp it with a hammer. That was the way they did the first coins, silver coins. Later on, with what happened with them, it was such an irregular coin, it was hard to tell when people were shaving it, cutting pieces of silver of it off. So that's when they finally went to an established type or design and weight of coins for them. They didn't only cut these. I've got an 1/8 at home, where they cut an 1/8, just pie shape. That's how they cut them for the most part. And they would weigh that. That's how they made change when you're dealing with silver and stuff. I wanted to move on just a few minutes. I alluded to one of the things that got me back into the colonial aspect was researching my ancestors. And I grew up and lived all my life within 2 miles of the first artisans that came here in 1730, and never knew it until later years. I worked the field on that farm where his house stood. And in later years, just not so many years ago, when one of our kin folks way down the line died, they had the original land grant in the trunk. And a lot of the other stuff they told me. I live right now within 2 miles, a mile and a half, of where Jasper Hardison bought the first 1 square mile, 640 acres was his first named ring grant down. Wound up getting several more after that. But I can stand in his living room, and all the artifacts that you see in this right here, not all I got for there, but all of those artifacts right there come from Jasper Hardison's house site, and activity there ceased in about 1850. It ran from 1723 to about 18. Artifacts at this house site disappeared in 1850. There were some other house sites further back from the river. This sits right on the Roanoke River, overlooking Roanoke River. And it's, as you're coming down the Roanoke, heading to Plum, right there at his home place is the last high ground. It's about 6 miles from there by water around Plymouth. But it's the last high ground, and we're talking 30, 40 foot bank from the river down to the river. I mean, from the field down to the river. And so, and there was a landing there. There was a lot of activity there. Found a lot of stuff there. A lot of buttons. And something we just don't find in this part of the country, and that's cut English silver. And that piece right there is cut English silver, and is 1763. Fortunately, this one's got the last 2 dates of the coin on it. So I know that's 1763. But we found a lot of cut coins there. So they would, and I later on found out through some of my kinfolks, the research that they did, they actually did do a lot of commercial stuff. Like they shipped a lot of stuff out there, they bought a lot of stuff there. And so there was a lot of activity there. Pipe stems everywhere, buttons everywhere, you know. And I've actually dug down and I located about 2.5 feet in the ground is the chimney base. The brick chimney base is still 2.5 feet ground, right in the middle of that short field, right there. So I can actually go right there and stand in here living room. That was neat for me. But anyhow, you know, we're running out of time. Didn't get a chance to mention a lot of stuff I wanted to, but I got to do this before we leave. This is something that you're never going to get probably to see again. And that you're not going to see it unless you go to a museum, and you may get to see it. These are inaugural buttons for George Washington inaugural buttons. Wow. And the first one that you see here was, and the reason we know, it was done in Philadelphia. And in order to have this particular button here, you had to be in his army as an officer. This is how you got to have this particular button. This middle one here, for years, everybody thought it was done at his commemoration of his death in 1799. That's what they thought for a long, but they found in the last 7-8 years, that this button was actually done 3 or 4 years before that. And this one button that you see on the corner right here, it's got long live the presidents, it's 15 stars around it, and there's only 3 known to exist. So these pretty rare buttons, and like I say, and they're pretty good shape. Pretty good shape. Just in the last, and if you want to really to delve into this and really know something about George Washington inaugural buttons, we come in the last 15 years to realize that there are 100 varieties almost of George Washington inaugural type buttons. A lot of them were made for the occasion to be sold to people, and here it is. It was a small group of people that's getting these, you know. But to find 3 different variations of these things on the South Shore, and one of the other things, there's 2 things a metal detector likes to do. The holy grail for a metal detector is to find a George Washington inaugural button and a gold coin. That's the 2 holy grails for a metal detector. But anyhow, for me to find 3 of them, I'm extremely lucky. And but here again, I wanted to mention those. I didn't want to miss those out. Anyhow, they're here. I'll be glad to answer any questions that I can. And when y'all get up to come up and look at you're certainly welcome to look at anything. Didn't get a chance to say cufflinks was the early on thing. 1700s early. All these cufflinks are silver. There's one gold one, which you rarely ever find that. But occasionally you'll find a silver, but most of them are metallic stuff like that. Anyhow, I'm good.
Did you find most of them with a metal detector, or did you find them by digging?
No, sir. I retrieved most everything with a metal detector. I started a metal detector in 1966. and back then, metal detectors weren't a thing. There were still guys using World War II mine sweepers.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
A long time ago, I read where Goodyear made buttons for the Northern Army out of rubber.
Yes, sir. Pat got 4 of them. 1850 they got Goodyear patent date 1851 on the back of them.
You found some?
Yes, sir. Got 4.
How does a metal detector find clay pipe stems?
It don't, you pick, that's eyesight.
I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, and
Maybe I
glass-
thought maybe it had some metal in the clay.
No, the glass shards and all that stuff is eyeball stuff, and clay marble. That's another I didn't bring. Clay marbles you find them around colonial sites all different sized clay marbles. Yeah. A lot of this stuff is eyeball stuff. If it's metal, that's what I use. Metal. That right there come from Buckham Hall. That belonged to one of Colonel Buckham's children. It's a toy cannon. That's another thing that was big with early colonials, and I've got 5 different sizes of these cannons. Children, it was a toy, evidently.
I just wondered, my dad was a junker bottle collector, so, you know, a metal detector didn't do him any good, right? But he would find other things while he was digging. So in the reverse, do you find bottles and other kinds of things that you're not really that interested in?
Absolutely. Yeah. Most of them are broken. I have been fortunate to, while I was digging other things, and I have come into areas where I knew there was some busted glass, and I dug them out and found a few bottles. Most of them are broken. The shards, this grouping right here, all this is that come from England. That's the English crown mug thing right there. All these things here are dated. Your blue feather edge, your green feather edge, the blue is, the green is first. That's about early 1800s, maybe late 1790s, early 1800s. Then the blue feather edge came in after that. And these other pieces are English and import stuff. These pieces right here is from a case gem bottle that I was doing the same thing. I was digging down because I was digging through brick. And I come across several, a crushed whole case gem bottle. If you don't know what a case gem bottle is, they ship them. They're real tall. You seen them, the bottles shaped like that? It's called a case gem bottle. And that's what that was. And the whole thing had been crushed by the brick down there. And I kept several of those pieces of it.
So I'm guessing that the metal detector tells you where to go, but did you look at maps and
Research is the key to it all. Yeah. But I have located, I've documented 62 house sites that I can date from the early 1700s to at least 1840.
I need to talk to you.
But I have no earthly idea who lived in most of them. You know, these are sites that I've come across looking for other things. You know, too, in areas that I know. So, but it's just a matter of a lot of legwork. But research is the key.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something. You're talking about the Buncombe house. You know, was that General Edward Buncombe?
Yes, ma'am.
He is here in Philadelphia, I know.
He's what?
He is here in Christ Church in Philadelphia.
Oh yes, ma'am. He is, and his wife is here.
His wife is buried in St. Paul's.
Sure
Right
is.
down the aisle. I sit beside her every Sunday.
I have 2 things I would like for you to share that you told me. One is where you found the George Washington commemoration inaugural buttons. That's a mouthful. And
Yeah.
the other is what you told me about the Hardison's Davenports and Blunts, which shows how people came to be in this area.
Well, actually, divulging the sites where the buttons come from, I probably can't do.
Don't you don't have to be specific, but
Well, there are 2 of them. One of them came from the Mackey's area, and one I have come just across the bridge in Martin County.
But what's your speculation as to what the person was doing there?
Well, the one that I found could have come from anyone going or coming, or who lived in the Mackey's area. The other one, I'm pretty sure, I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty sure that the other one belonged to an Everett. Because the area that I found it in, I knew there's a 1700s house site there. I knew they were there. and he served in the Continental Army. So,
What was the name?
and he was an officer, and he served in the Continental Army, and he was an Everett.
I didn't know that.
And Everett, is the name Everett?
Everett, yes, sir. Everetts were early in the area. The Carkeeks and Pollocks, I'm sure those of you done any research in the area, you're familiar with those names. The Davenports, the Hardisons, and Shogo, you know, those names, most of those names are still in the area. There are some who's not there. The guy who established Plymouth, Arthur Rhodes, his wife Mary was Jasper Hardison's daughter. And of course, back in that day, you didn't marry someone 100 miles away. You married somebody down the road, you know. Or if you were a certain family, you married into another family that was up to your level, you know, that sort of thing. That's the way it was done back then. And, you know, young ladies were always looking, more things change, more stay the same. the young ladies were looking for, you know, their security, because ladies back then were not included. You know, ladies back then were not included. Now I got to say, Jasper was what he had. Jasper had 7 sons and 2 daughters. That's why there's so many Hardisons around. But he made provisions as well for his 2 daughters and his wife, which was unusual in that point in time. He made provisions for all 3 of them.
And many important men married rich widows. Let's not
Absolutely,
forget that.
absolutely.
Thomas Jefferson,
George Washington.
George
George
Washington, the list goes on. Let's not forget that.
Oh, absolutely. And in this area, if you get into the Davenports and stuff, it happened. That's the way it was. That's the way it was then. Yeah. And wasn't uncommon for either spouse to have had 3 or 4 spouses. Wasn't uncommon. Okay, my time's up.